All right. Well, welcome to our 11th installment of our 2021 CSP webinar series. This topic will be covering Windows 11 and Windows 365, some of the new features that Microsoft has recently released. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the presentation here. But if you have any questions, feel free to come off mute or use the chat window to ask any questions, and we'll try to address those as they come up. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk about Windows 11, what's new, what are the requirements. You've probably heard about some steep hardware requirements that might have you wondering why. How do we upgrade to Windows 11? How do we get it? And then what's new for work? How does it impact us in the business world? And then probably what's more interesting for most of us is probably going to be the Windows 365, the Windows Cloud PC options. So I'm going to mostly focus on Windows 365. I do have Windows or Azure Virtual Desktop listed here as a topic, but I'm really just going to briefly touch upon that because that's such a large discussion of in itself that we could have a whole session dedicated to that. But I really want to contrast, when does it make sense to use Windows 365 and when does it make sense to use Azure Virtual Desktop? So looking at the requirements for Windows 11, if you're like me, when you saw the requirements for Windows 11, you probably got pretty upset because they're pretty steep. And you look at this slide, and it doesn't really look like there's a whole lot here. You know, 1 gigahertz, 2-core, compatible 64-bit CPU or system on a chip, and you would think that's not a pretty steep requirement. But the key word here is compatible. There's a lot that gets compacted into that one word. And I've got a link at the bottom of the slide here that takes you to at least the Intel supported processors, a whole list of all the Intel supported processors. But what this boils down to is if you're running an Intel Core 8th generation or an AMD Ryzen 2nd generation processor or newer, you should be all right. But anything older than that, you're going to have problems. And that really means any hardware that's about 4 or 5 years old is probably not going to be supported for Windows 11. My laptop I'm using today is 5 years old, so it doesn't meet those requirements. It's got a 6th gen Intel Core processor, and it will not let me update through the normal channels. The other requirements here, the RAM, the hard drive, nothing else really stands out. The TPM 2.0 is a new one that I'll touch upon here in a little bit, but that's, I guess, if you want to call that a steeper requirement, but even my 5-year-old laptop has a 2.0 TPM, so I don't want to say that that's going to be the bottleneck or the reason most devices can't upgrade. But there's going to be some other hardware specifications as well based on some of the features that you may want to use. So, for example, if you wanted to use Windows Hello with biometrics, obviously you're going to need something that can process those biometric signals like a near-infrared camera or a fingerprint reader. Spatial sound needs speaker hardware that can support that. Client Hyper-V or client virtualization is going to require second-level address translation in the processor, which pretty much every processor has. But that's just a couple examples of additional features within Windows that aren't necessarily like core features to run Windows 11, but maybe some things to get over if you are looking to upgrade to Windows 11 and use all the capabilities. So you might be wondering, why is Microsoft putting in this steep requirement on processors? Why can't I upgrade my 7th gen or 6th gen Intel Core processor? And that really comes down to how Windows 11 was developed. They really are embracing the zero trust principles, and you'll see this term used quite a bit when you see Windows 11 marketing or documentation out there, is this chip to cloud security. And what that really means is they're trying to incorporate security all the way from your hardware all the way up through the cloud and everything in between. And that diagram on the left kind of shows you all the different parts and levels of or layers between the chip and the cloud that security is being focused on. So because of that, there's certain hardware requirements that need to be supported at the PC level. And a lot of these are based on capabilities in those processors. So the concept here of hardware root of trust and silicon assisted security, the hardware root of trust is really that TPM chip. And if you're not familiar with what a TPM is, it's a hardware-based security chip or a device that's on your motherboard that stores sensitive information. So like your BitLocker encryption keys, Windows Hello credentials, it's all based on the TPM security chip. There's other things like security or Windows Defender System Guard that also relies on the TPM, but the Microsoft specifications say you have to have a TPM 2.0 now. That's what Microsoft will document, but you can actually get away with a TPM 1.2 with a little bit of an asterisk there that not all these features will be supported. To take things a little bit further, Microsoft has actually developed in conjunction with the silicone manufacturers what they're calling the Pluton security processor. And that's just a fancy new name or code name for what Microsoft wants to consider a in-chip TPM. So within the processor itself is the TPM chip. They viewed having a secondary chip on the motherboard as a potential risk because if the processor and the TPM chip are separate, that means there's a communication channel between those two chips on the motherboard, and that's a potential hardware vulnerability that could be exploited. So if you put the TPM within the processor, you eliminate that risk. So kind of taking it above and beyond when it comes to some of the security at the hardware level there. But the other part here is silicone-assisted security, and this is based on a lot of the virtualization capabilities. And nothing's really new with the concepts of virtualization. It's just how the processor and the operating system are starting to leverage some of these virtualization capabilities. Some of these things were around with Windows 10 as feature enhancements over time, but by default, these are all within Windows 11. And one of these is called virtualization-based security, or VBS. And this is a process in which the processor creates a virtualized region of memory that is used to isolate certain processes from the core operating system kernel processes. So, in an example, if you wanted to open up a untrusted Word document or run some untrusted application that was downloaded, the processor and the operating system stand that up in virtualized or a segregated region of memory so that if there is a vulnerability that's being exploited in memory, it can't go outside of that dedicated region of memory, and it protects or restricts the bad actor from being able to reach the operating system kernel processes. Same thing with the hypervisor protected code integrity. This is kind of a similar concept into VBS. It actually uses VBS, but it's a way for the processor to validate whether the Windows kernel code or drivers or app code is actually signed and validated before running that code. And again, running it in a virtualized space. So if there's a vulnerability or a breach, it's contained into that space. So when we look at all the security features that are based on the hardware, it kind of makes sense now that Microsoft has established some pretty strict requirements for the processors. And, unfortunately for a lot of us that have some older hardware, that we kind of looked at that as just Microsoft wanting, more hardware sales. But it makes sense now that there are certain pieces of Windows 11 that depend on those capabilities that are only available in 8th generation core processors or second and up generation Ryzen processors. So now we know the requirements. How do we get Windows 11? So there's technically two different methods based on whether you're consumer or a business PC. And when I say consumer, it's your personal computer or any unmanaged device, really. It's just being driven by the main user of that machine. So the first item is the installation assistant. And if you just open up a web browser and Google Windows 11 download, it'll take you right to the page that gives you the option to download and install the Windows 11 installation assistant. Oddly enough, this really just calls another app from the Microsoft App Store called the PC Health Check app. But what the PC Health Check app will do is check your system qualifications for Windows 11, and if it meets all the bare minimums, it will allow the Windows 11 installation assistant to do an in-place upgrade of your system. The other options are you can use the installation media tool. And this is something that's been around since Windows 7. It's a downloadable app that essentially gives you the ability to create your own installation media. So you can create a bootable flash drive and it will pull down the bits and bytes for creating that flash drive, or an ISO image, an offline disk image, in which you can burn to a physical disk and then use to perform installations. And I kind of call it out here as a third option as just the ISO file, even though the installation media tool can pull that image down. But the reason I call this out is with an ISO file, you can technically, in an unsupported fashion, get Windows 11 to run on Intel Core Generation 6 and 7 processors, as well as TPM 1.2. So you can't do that in-place upgrade. It has to be a fresh install. It can only be installed from ISO to do that on that older processor hardware. But you've kind of got a workaround. Now, the catch there is that Microsoft will not fully support that. So definitely don't use that as your primary means of distribution across your businesses. But for most of us who are on the IT admin side, we manage and maintain our own devices. That's a risk that most of us are probably willing to take ourselves just to get Windows 11. So just be aware that it's not technically supported. Now on the business side, there's a couple things that we need to take into consideration. One is that's kind of prepping or assessing your environment across all of your PCs. Since you're not just upgrading one, you might be upgrading 50, 100, 1,000 computers. You want to get a good idea of what you have, and that's where things like endpoint analytics come into play and update compliance. And these are based on certain licensing requirements as well. So, for endpoint analytics, you really need to have Intune licensing. You can use this with ConfigMan in the co-managed state. You need to have devices that are hybrid or Azure AD hybrid joined or Azure AD joined. Azure AD registered and workplace joined devices are not supported, and Windows needs to be Windows 10 1903 Pro or higher for endpoint analytics. And I am not the systems management person, but luckily we've got a couple guys on the call who are. So I am going to defer to Chris Ball and Rick Streckel on giving a little more detail on what differences there are between what you may have heard about in the past as desktop analytics, and we actually covered that as part of a previous session, and what endpoint analytics are. So Chris and Rick, if you don't mind jumping in here and giving a little more content or context around the differences of those two services.
Sure. Yeah. So for those of you that have been with us since the start of this webinar series, we talked about desktop analytics at the beginning of the year, and it was a great place to go to figure out whether or not your devices are in a state where they can, move to different feature builds or different versions. And as of November 22nd or November 2022. Endpoint or desktop analytics is going away, and they're rolling in a lot of those features and functions from desktop analytics into Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So you'll start to see, if you're using desktop analytics today, some of those features get rolled into Endpoint Manager. Now, if you're looking at Endpoint Analytics specifically, that gives you more information as to how your device is performing from a productivity standpoint. It really got added because of the hybrid work. Hybrid work became a big deal, as we all know, back in 2020. And this is a way to tell you, this workstation is performing pretty slowly due to these cumulative updates or these patches and stuff. So that's really the main difference between those two. But you'll start to leverage the same features and functions from desktop analytics and endpoint analytics as you start to assess Windows 11. Just know the desktop analytics is going away as of next year.
November 30th, I believe, 2022.
Is it?
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, guys.
And just one note on that, Chris covered it, but you guys probably noticed they're trying to consolidate a lot of portals, a lot of, especially on the security side. So this is just another attempt to remove one portal and put it all in one location.
Cool. Thank you. So if you're able to use endpoint analytics, great. That's the preferred method to kind of discovering and identifying what devices you have that are capable of Windows 11 and which aren't. But if you can't use endpoint analytics, there's update compliance, which is pretty much a report that Intune will generate. So it still requires Intune management of your devices, but it does an assessment of the devices, and it gives you kind of that second screenshot there on the bottom, just kind of a simple analysis of what devices are ready for and Windows 11 and what aren't. But if you can't run any of those, if you have devices that aren't fully managed by Intune, then you do have a option to run a hardware readiness PowerShell script that Microsoft has provided. Now, this is really geared towards one-off situations because it only reports back on a single PC. So the trend here, if you haven't picked up on it, is Microsoft really wants you to manage all of your devices through the cloud, through Intune, because that's where a lot of the capabilities are being provided. So could you deploy the readiness script via like GPO and whatnot and have it report back to a central repository to collect all the readiness files? Yeah, absolutely. But it's just not as simple and easy, I guess, if you have all your devices managed by Intune to identify which ones can be upgraded to Windows 11 and which ones can't.
Chris, real quick, I'm going to drop a link in the chat for everyone. They can go check out Microsoft's blog on endpoint analytics if they want to grab some more information around that.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so after you assess your readiness, you need to start planning how you're going to manage Windows 11. And the good point, or the good thing in here, is that essentially all the tools that you used in the past are still available to be used to manage Windows 11. There's no groundbreaking, earth-shattering new features or capabilities that are required to manage Windows 11. So if you're doing group policy, if you're using Intune or Configuration Manager, great, still works the same. Now, I won't say that for sure for all third-party tools. So if you do have a third-party solution out there that's managing images or deploying updates or applications, you're going to have to check with your third-party software vendor on that. But for all the Microsoft-related tools, as I mentioned, group policy, there's administrative templates that will be downloadable for Windows 11 to extend group policy to manage new features and capabilities in Windows 11. Microsoft has actually provided dedicated security baselines for Windows 11. So if you wanted to assess, the security posture of individual workstations and the configuration of the OS in general, Microsoft has those baselines readily available. And then your update processes are still the same. If you're using Windows Server Update or Windows Update for Business, those are all going to work. So you don't really have to invest in any new technologies or solutions or even upgrade, for the most part, anything that you have today to be able to manage Windows 11.
So Chris, real quick as a side note, for when it comes to managing Windows 11, if you're using Configuration Manager today, make sure that you are on build 2107. So that was the build released in July. That build officially supports Windows 11 as a client for imaging and other functionality, software deployments, that sort of stuff for Windows 11 through ConfigMan. So
cool. Yeah, good point there. Thanks. All right. So for deploying Windows 11, the main point I want to get across here is that Microsoft will not automatically push out Windows 11 to any of your managed devices. You have to take some kind of action as an administrator to enable Windows 11 to be rolled out. So don't expect your devices to automatically just appear one day as Windows 11 upgraded from Windows 10. But you may have your Windows Update server update services or Update for Business already configured to support Windows 11. So in that case, I guess technically they could roll out without you going in and doing something today, but you would have had to enable that in the past. The update really gets, or the upgrade really gets deployed out as an update. You can use Windows Server Update Services, Update for Business. You can use the Windows Assessment and Deployment Kit, ConfigMan. All of those can be used to push out Windows 11 as a in-place upgrade, as a update to Windows 11 or Windows 10. You do have to enable the Windows 11 product categories in some of those tools, and as well as maybe a couple other configurations to set like the minimum target version and product versions. But they follow really a similar pattern or a process that you may have probably experienced with Windows 10. I do also list Windows Autopilot here as an option, and it's not necessarily a upgrade option, because it's a reprovision. If you do a reset on Windows 10, you're going to get Windows 10 again. It's not just going to magically update to Windows 11 through Autopilot. But if you're provisioning a new device, you got new Windows 11 devices out, you can still use Autopilot to automate the configuration and deployment of Windows 11, how you did Windows 10 in the past. So again, not necessarily an upgrade path, but it's more of a deployment path for Windows 11. And the last item here I want to touch upon is the Windows 11 lifecycle. So with Windows 10, you may be aware, if you keep close eye on how updates are pushed out, that Windows 10 had 2 major feature updates per year. You had a spring and fall update cycle, but with Windows 11, there's only going to be one. So major updates will be pushed out on an annual basis. That doesn't mean that cumulative quality updates are going to be delayed. You're still going to have those monthly cumulative quality updates that get rolled out every month, but also security updates are going to be pushed out as they become available. So it's not like you're really losing out on security there, because major updates or major features aren't going to be twice per year. They're just kind of simplifying that as to once per year. Windows 10 does have an established end of life in October 2025. And I know that's about a little less than 4 years away, so we've got time to get to Windows 11. So if you have hardware that doesn't support Windows 11, you have 4 years to replace that hardware that does support Windows 11. But come October 2025, Windows 10 will go out of support. The support servicing is extended for Windows Home and Pro. So in Windows 10, that was an 18-month servicing period. In Windows 11, for Home and Pro, you'll get 2 years, 24 months. On the enterprise side, Windows 10 was 18 and 30 months, whereas Windows 11 is going to be 36 months. So they've kind of extended out some of the supportability on those versions of Windows with Windows 11 than what you got in Windows 10. I know I'm speaking very fast, but I'm trying to get through all the content, so definitely don't hesitate to interrupt with any questions. All right, so what's new in Windows 11? For the most part, Windows 11 is a facelift. You probably have heard it before, but it's a facelift that makes it very Mac OS looking, and that would be a fairly accurate statement, but it's not a bad thing. But as far as new features and capabilities, at least from what the end users see, there's not a whole lot, to be honest. There is a lot of improvements underneath the hood, and those mostly focus around the security side of things. But if you're looking at what your users will see, there's the Power Automate desktop integration. So users can create Power Automate or Flow automation within the desktop itself. It's natively built into Windows 11 so that they can automate some of their personal tasks. The same thing with Teams, but I personally feel Microsoft kind of missed the mark a little bit here with Teams, because if you remember back in the Skype days, there was Skype for Business and then there was just Skype, the consumer side of Skype. Well, that's what's built into Windows 11 is the consumer side of Teams. So Teams Enterprise, or the Enterprise app at least, still needs to be deployed and installed on Windows 11 on top of the Teams consumer. And I'll show you that interface if you haven't seen it here yet on Windows 11. I'll just pull up a VM real quick that I built of it so you can see what that looks like. But that's kind of the main visible impacts to Windows 11. The things that are underneath the hood that are worth mentioning are around security. So one thing I don't have listed here is update sizes. So Microsoft has made updates more efficient and faster because they are on average about 40% smaller packages than what they used to be in Windows 10. So that should increase the not just the reliability, but the efficiency of keeping all your devices up to date. The TPM now encrypts and signs device health attestation signals. So you can use those for conditional access. So now that is actually secured by the TPM itself. DNS by default will use HTTPS, and this is following the zero trust principles of implying that the network is on an untrusted boundary. And by requiring secure DNS, that way you can be a little more confident that your DNS queries aren't being intercepted and then you're being returned malicious or fraudulent DNS query results because someone is intercepting that communication. Other security capabilities are around the Wi-Fi or wireless network access. So WPA3 is now the current protocol in use, and Windows 11 fully supports that. But it also supports what's called opportunistic wireless encryption. And this is designed more for your public Wi-Fi spaces. Now, the public Wi-Fi has to support this as well, but typically these are unsecure, unencrypted Wi-Fi networks. Windows will try to establish an encrypted channel with the wireless network itself, even when it's not being enforced by the wireless network or this SSID or anything like that. So kind of a cool capability, but again, that's going to be dependent on the public Wi-Fi hardware as well. The native VPN client is now fully integrated with Azure AD. So doing single sign-on with Azure AD is all supported, as well as using Azure MFA. So using conditional access policies with the native VPN client is now capable. Windows Defender Application Guard goes back to that virtualization on the chip capabilities, and this is where we're running untrusted websites or untrusted Office files in isolated areas, so that if they are compromised or if they have vulnerabilities, any kind of compromise stays contained within those virtualized environments, even though from the end user perspective, it's just Windows running and opening up a file, right? And then lastly, Windows 11 config lock. This is a way for Windows to monitor specifically the registry, but the system configuration to help identify when a system is drifting away from the desired end state configuration. So as time goes on and new apps are installed, new settings are applied, things like that, it gives you visibility into identifying when a machine is kind of drifting away of where you want it to be. But as things are added, there are things that have been removed as well. So I'm not going to go through each one of these, but these are just a small list of some of the deprecated features. Most of them are not business critical items here. These are more on the consumer side, things that probably a lot of business users didn't even take advantage of. But two things really to point out are the last two, the Windows Deployment Services. That's technically listed as deprecated, but that's just partially deprecated. If you're still using Windows Deployment Services, this pretty much means any workflows that you have that rely on the boot WIM image file, those are no longer supported. But Windows Deployment Services as a whole is not deprecated. And then the Windows Store for Business, there's a change in there to where the private store tab is no longer visible. So I know I talked a lot there on Windows 11. I want to get into some of the Windows 365 and cloud PCs, but let me pull over, if I can get my computer to, taskbar is not working for me, there we go. Windows 11, oh great, my virtual machine just went to sleep as I opened that up. That's fantastic.
That has happened to me plenty of times, Chris. I totally know that pain.
Missed it by that much, right?
You could blame me and Rick for being long-winded on our one slide.
Yeah. I would use my host laptop as an example, but I am still running Windows 10 since I haven't put myself in that unsupported state with Windows 11 because I'm a 6th gen Intel processor, but here we go, come on. So I am not going to spend a whole lot of time of showing this because probably most of you have already seen it. But major changes is just, as I said, it's a facelift. You'll see this icon down here. This is the new Teams integration. So the chat, if I open that up, this is not Teams Enterprise. So this is that consumer channel of Teams. And you're going to have to log into this with a Microsoft account, which means it's a like an Outlook.com, a Hotmail.com. If it is a Office 365 enabled account, or a Live ID, yes, thanks. If it's a Office 365 account or a work or school account, it will not log in here. You will have to get the Teams for Work or School, which is the enterprise version of Teams. So that's just a communications thing to your end users. Make sure that they understand that that's not Teams that they would use for work. That is Teams that they would use at home. Other enhancements are these new virtual desktops, so you could create multiple desktops. That's kind of similar to what Windows 10 had as well. And then widgets. Another thing about this is that you have to be signed in with an account to get the widgets to appear. If you're using like a local admin account that is not a cloud account to log into the PC, this won't populate. It'll ask you to sign in when you try to load the widgets. And these are just kind of, if you remember the start menu in Windows 10, you could kind of put some live tiles and stuff, and they started to put some, I can't remember the name of it on Win 10 down at the bottom right where it would pop up like the news and interests. It's kind of making that its own field here. And you can customize these widgets to kind of pull in content that you want. But if you didn't use a lot of that stuff in Windows 10, probably not going to get a whole lot of value out of it here. But I know a big flashy demo here because this is Windows 11. That's pretty much the main thing. Start menu is not the folders anymore. You can get to all apps, which gives you that scroll ability to go down through all the apps alphabetically. But there's no folders or anything for the start menu. And all these pinned apps are the same thing as pinning them in the start menu in Windows 10. But this is going to pre-populate with a lot of stuff that Microsoft thinks is relevant. All right, so unless there's any questions on Windows 11, I'll assume that most of you have probably already seen that and are playing with it already. I want to get into cloud PCs.
Chris, real quick, for those of you folks that are doing some customization to your taskbar today, customization to the taskbar in Windows 11 is still supported. So you can still customize your start menu and taskbar. So if you're using an XML file to do that today, you can still continue to do it. Just know that there are some features and functions within the XML file that Microsoft's going to, that are deprecated and that Microsoft's going to retire at some point in the future.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to try to go through this fast again because I want to get to the demos to actually show some stuff that you guys probably want to see. But we talked about Windows 11 and how we get that on a traditional PC. So there's pretty much three ways to consume Windows 11. One is on that, the physical hardware, and the benefit that provides is that it gives you a lot of variation, a lot of options as far as form factors and price points. HP, Dell, Lenovo, Microsoft themselves are all producing hardware that run Windows 11, and you can get very basic PCs with, Celeron processors and 4 gigs of RAM all the way up to workhorses with i9s and 64 gigs of RAM, and you can pay for what you want from a hardware perspective, right? So you have a lot of options when it comes to the physical realm. When we talk about cloud PCs, there's really two options. There's Azure Virtual Desktop, and then there's Windows 365. So Azure Virtual Desktop is really designed for flexibility and control. It's going to be a VDI or a virtual desktop infrastructure solution. It's Microsoft's solution. And I'll touch upon that in a little bit. But what we're going to mostly focus on is Windows 365. And the difference here is that Windows 365 is designed for simplicity. If you really get into the nuts and bolts of it, Azure Virtual Desktop is a platform as a service offering, meaning that you have control over a lot of the configurations of the services underneath the hood. So it's essentially virtual machines running in Azure. You may not have a lot of control over how the services are designed for presenting those virtual desktops, but you have a lot of control on what your user experience will be. Windows 365 builds upon Azure Virtual Desktop, but it is the software as a solution or SaaS offering of Windows 11. So instead of having a lot of that visibility underneath the hood of, here's all the virtual machine pools and all that, you're just given a desktop, and they try to make it as simple as possible. And I think through the demos, you'll see how simple it can be. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of using Windows 365. There's two flavors, business and enterprise. Business, there are technically no underlying license requirements. Now, I put an asterisk there because you don't need a M365 business premium or a business standard or any of those licenses to assign a Windows virtual or a Windows 365 desktop license, but you're not going to get the full capability out of that desktop without at least an Exchange Online P1 license for messaging. But there's technically no underlying licensing requirements. You are capped at 300 seats because it is business, and that's how all the business SKUs work. They're designed for 300 and less seat in organizations. But there are some restrictions on networking capabilities. So this is based on the license or the SKU size, I guess, of Windows 365 Business that you choose. So if you choose a configuration that has 2 gigs of RAM, you get 12 gigs of outbound internet traffic per month. If you go up to the 32 gig RAM instance, you get 70 gigs of outbound data per month for that instance. That's per user, not per tenant, that's per user. Obviously, there's different ranges of RAM configurations within those SKUs, so and that fluctuates the outbound traffic. But just be aware that there are caps on how much outbound data can be consumed through the business SKUs. There is one note that I would want to point out on business, or 2 more notes actually. First is for business, Windows 11, at least as of my testing earlier or late last week, Windows 11 is not natively rolled out to business, Windows 365 for business. And I'll show you that here in a little bit, but it doesn't mean that it's not coming or you can't get it. It's just not the default images that you're being provided are Windows 10. The other point that I'll point out on business is there is a hybrid benefit to Windows 365 business only. And this hybrid benefit through CSP gives you approximately a 16% discount on those Windows 365 licenses. The requirement, though, is that those users consuming those licenses are accessing their Windows 365 Cloud PC from a Windows 10 or 11 Pro or Enterprise licensed device. At least once per month, they have to access their Cloud PC with a properly licensed Windows 10 or 11 Pro device. But that gives you the option to save a little bit on those Cloud PC licenses if you are in the business SKU realm and all your users are already using Windows 10 or Windows 11 Pro. On the enterprise side, we have some steeper requirements. On the enterprise side, we do need to have, this is odd, Windows 365 Enterprise does not come with the Windows license. You have to have a Windows license, and that's going to either be through a Windows 10 or Windows 11 Enterprise E3 license or through one of the M365 licenses, an F3 or above. But you also need some security licenses. You have to have Intune, and you have to have Azure AD Premium 1. And this is because the way these devices are provisioned out, and I'll show you this in the demo. But so if you look at the underlying license requirements for Windows 365 Enterprise, you have to have at minimum a Windows E3 and an EMS E3 or an M365 F3. You could technically get away with some VDA licensing for Windows instead of the full E3. But that's kind of some more specific use cases there. The other part is you need to have an Azure subscription because these enterprise instances will leverage an Azure virtual network. So there are possibly some consumption costs for networking that are outside of your Windows 365 enterprise licensing that will be associated with your Azure consumption. You also have to have a Active Directory presence, and that has to be synchronized to Azure AD as well. So you have to be running hybrid identities. For enterprise, there is no cap on how many seats that you have. It is unlimited, so it's really geared towards scaling up to even the most large organizations out there. If we look at the administration, business is very basic. It's going to try to be as simple as possible. You get standard images. You can't do customized images. It's pretty much what Microsoft provides within Intune to push out the standard Windows 10 or Windows 11 image. Device management I list here is limited, even if you have Intune or Endpoint Manager. Now, you cannot use ConfigMan or Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager to manage these devices. They can only be managed via Intune. And you don't have any analytics or partner management with business instances. Microsoft owns a lot of the configuration because one, they are very simple to deploy, but they want to make sure that it is something that is reliable and stable. So Microsoft has taken away a little bit of that capability for you to customize the instances. Doesn't mean you can't install your own apps, and the users can't install apps on those instances on business, but there is some limitations. On the enterprise side, you can use the default gallery images for Windows 10 and 11, or you can upload your own customized images. So if you have a custom image that you're deploying to physical hardware today, you could technically use that in the cloud as well. You do have full device management, and because it is going to be integrated with Active Directory, all your GPO management still pulls over, and you can use all of that. And then as far as the monitoring and the analytics, that's all capable, and Defender for Endpoint and stuff like that is all built into Enterprise. For the user experience, as I mentioned before, business is limited, so you have no domain capabilities. These are a no domain setup. They can only be Azure AD joined, not hybrid joined, Azure AD joined, because there is no AD presence. The user experience, you will see on options there on the cloud PCs, the user will have a restart, reset, and rename option, and this will become more clear when I show you the demo, but that's a big item right there, specifically reset. And then each user is assigned what's equivalent to local admin rights, but it's not full local admin rights. And I'll show this in the demo as well. But users essentially operate their PC as a full admin. They can install their own applications. They can do some system reconfiguration, but that is going to be limited because it's not full system admin. Microsoft does protect some of that. Then access can be done through the remote desktop client, RDP client, or any HTML5 capable browser. So on the enterprise side, these are going to be domain joined. They have to be domain joined. But there's a difference in users don't have this ability to reset. And again, I'll show you that and explain more in detail why that's a big thing in the demo. By default, users are assigned as standard users on those images, but they can also be assigned as full local admins. All right, and then finally, on the security side, a lot of this is going to be based on additional licensing with business. So if you have just the Windows 365 license, you're not going to be able to take advantage of conditional access or MFA or Defender for Endpoint. But if you have the licensing to support those features, Azure ADP1, Intune, Defender for Endpoint, you can leverage those capabilities with a business instance. But one item here is that you can only use conditional access driven MFA. You cannot use per user MFA, which you can do in enterprise. Per user MFA, if you're not familiar with it, is a per user set in the Azure MFA service that requires MFA under all conditions, under all scenarios. So it's not conditional access driven. Often you see that with administrative accounts. Business images cannot take advantage of that. Only enterprise images can do that. All right, so this is what I really wanted to get to, and that is our demo. So let me jump in here. Find the right tenant. All right, so I have two tenants set up. One is my business and one is my enterprise. My business tenant, I'm logged into Endpoint Manager, and if you go into Endpoint Manager, go to Devices, and then down to Windows 365, you'll see this screen, Increase Productivity with Windows 365. You get no configuration options because it is business. So this isn't an error, this isn't a problem here, this is the expected visual. And that might be confusing because you would expect something to be here. If they have it listed as a topic here on the left, you would think there'd be something here on the right, but it's not. This is what you would expect to see. And that is because you really don't have much configuration with the business SKU. So once you buy a Windows 365 business SKU, how do we provision out the desktop to the end user? Well, that's actually very easy. And in this lab, I'm a big Bang Theory fan, so all my test users are Big Bang characters. But here I've got Leonard. If I look at his licensing, you'll see I have a Windows 365 business, 1 CPU, 2 gig, RAM, 64 gig hard drive, and that's one of the basic SKUs there just for this demo. But I only have one of those licenses. So I've already assigned it because I didn't want to wait through the whole provisioning process because it could take up to 15, 20 minutes for that provisioning to occur. But all you have to do is check the box for the license. And if you have an available license, that user will get a desktop. So when that user goes to log in, pull up my other screen here, they will see something very similar to this. This is actually my enterprise user, but I'm just going to pull up the screen so you can see it. If the image is still provisioning, they'll get a screen similar to this where it just says, hey, your desktop is being provisioned, and it'll just have this circle kind of spinning there. So I didn't want to waste 15 minutes while that sat there provisioning, but from a business perspective, that's all there is to it. Once you check that box, they get a Windows PC, and then they can access it using the RDP client, or they can use an HTML5 based browser. Now, I was going to go into the business PC here, but given that I've only got 10 minutes left, I'm going to jump into the enterprise because the end user experience for the most part is very similar, so I'm not going to duplicate myself there. When we look at enterprise, though, the first thing you might be wondering is how do we get enterprise stood up? So the first thing we need to do is actually look at our Active Directory. Now I have a domain controller installed in Azure. This could be an on-prem domain controller, but you need to go to Active Directory first. And we have to set up Active Directory to support Windows 365 for provisioning Windows desktops into our environment. So I've done a little pre-work here in case the Azure stops working. I have screenshots of all this, but I'm going to try to go through all the actual steps so you can see what it looks like. So the first thing we want to do is create a new security group. And I've got one that's already named test in here, but I'm just going to call this W365 users, global security group, hit OK. And then I want to go ahead and add my test users or my target users to that group. So Joe somebody is my test user in my demo here. So I'm going to add him to that group. Now, I should mention I am synchronizing this with Directory Connect. So this OU, AADC sync, this OU and all sub-OUs are being synchronized to Azure AD, so that new group will be synchronized as well. I'm also going to create, underneath my OU here, a secondary OU. I'm just going to call this W365 computers. And I don't need to put anything in here, but what I do need to make note of is if I go to the properties, and you have to enable the advanced features and the Active Directory users or computers to see this, but on the attribute editor, I want to make note of the distinguished name attribute. So I'm actually just going to do this, Notepad. In there. That's going to be important because I need to be able to tell Windows 365, the service, where to put all these computer objects. So I'll go ahead and click OK there. And I'm going to go ahead and kick off a synchronization, just so that these things get replicated up to Azure AD and they're visible to the cloud. So that's pretty much my setup of on-premises Active Directory. If I look at my Azure environment, let me pull up that browser here. Oops, wrong screen. Sorry, I've got too many windows open here. I think this is my enterprise. I can't see my tab because of the Teams bar. There we go. All right, so if I go to Azure, I've got my virtual domain controller sitting in Azure, and it's part of this core VNet, this virtual network. Now, I could just create another subnet underneath my core VNet, which contains my domain controller. But if we're following the zero trust principles, I really should create a separate virtual network. And this provides you another isolation or segmentation boundary between some of our core Active Directory resources and then our end user computing objects. So what I'm going to do here is create a new virtual network. I'm going to select my primary resource group, and I'm just going to name this Cloud PC VNet. On the IP address range, this should Azure should pull in a IP address range that is not in use by any of my other VNets. It should. But make sure that this address range does not overlap, especially with where your domain controller lies or where your virtual network gateway lies to connect to your on-premises environment. But I'm going to create this new VNet with this 10.2 network. And then I have this subnet as default. I can come in here and I can change this if I want. If I want to use this VNet for other things, I'll just say this is my cloud PC subnet. This is just a name, and I could change the address space here as well. So right now I've just got it as /24, but that's fine for my demo. Go to security, everything stays the same, and I'm just going to go review create. So this is creating a new virtual network in which all of my cloud PCs will be attached to, because they're going to be Azure virtual machines. We just won't see them, but they got to be able to talk on my network. So this is what also will give them access to on-premises resources. So if I had on-prem, like a site-to-site VNet gateway set up that could talk to my on-premise network, I could reach on-premises resources from my cloud PC or other resources I have deployed up in Azure. So I want to then take a look at my DNS settings here. So I'm not going to go to my virtual domain controller, but I know my virtual domain controller's IP address is 10.10 or 10.0.0.4. That is the IP address of my domain controller in Azure. I also have AD integrated DNS set up on that domain controller. So I want the VNet to be able to resolve my domain namespace of improvencSP.com, which is my Active Directory domain. So I go ahead and add in a custom IP address here for DNS. Now, right now, this cloud PC VNet is a separate VNet. It's completely isolated from my core VNet. So even though I put the 10.0.0.4 address in there for DNS, it can't talk to that domain controller to actually do name resolution. So I have to set up what's called peering on the VNet. So I'm coming from my cloud PC VNet, and I'm going to add a peering. And what this is a link between two VNets so that they can talk to each other. And then you can apply things like network security groups or Azure Firewall to restrict what can be done across those networks. So I'm going to say this is my cloud PC to domain. This is the link that I'm creating. So it's this virtual network, which is my cloud PC virtual network, to my domain network. But I also have to say, what's the remote link? And this is going to be my domain network to my cloud PC network. Now, this is just a name. This doesn't actually equate back to the VNet names. That's what I set right here. So the network I am peering with is my core VNet. And yes, I already used this in my, I'll just put 2 at the end of those. I already used that in my other sample setup, so I'm going to update that. Or just add a 2 at the end. So now I've got this peering. This is going to say updating for a little bit, but hopefully it will come back and say it is connected, which means now my 2 VNets can talk to each other. So I'm going to assume that's going to go through versus wait here and wait for it to update and say it's connected, because I know I'm really short on time. But now that we've got the Azure infrastructure side set up to support the networking, how do we get the images deployed? Well, first, we have to tell Windows 365 how to talk to our on-prem network. And I've got a test configuration set up here, but I'm going to walk through creating a new one based on the Azure settings we just did. So under, and this is, I'm sorry, this is under Endpoint Manager, Devices, and Windows 365. So when you look here, you actually see stuff versus business that was just a blank pane that said, hey, you know, welcome to Windows 365. We have options here because we can configure the Windows 365 service. So I'm coming over to on-premise network connections. I'm going to say create a new connection. And I am going to call this demo connection. Oops, I can type. I'm going to put this in my Azure subscription. Resource group is my primary resource group. And then which virtual network am I connecting this to? So the one we just created was this Cloud PC VNet. What subnet? So if it pulls properly, it's going to see the subnet that I created as well, or renamed from default as Cloud PC subnet. So now I'm telling Windows 365 where this connection will communicate to on the Azure Virtual Network. The next part here is, what is my domain information? Well, what's the namespace? Improven, it's not improven.com, it's improvencsp.com. That is the DNS namespace of my domain. And let's go back to that domain controller where I have my notepad. This is where that DN of the OU we created becomes important. So I'm going to copy that, and hopefully this will paste over to in here. Good. So I'm specifying our new OU to put all the computer objects. Now, I have to also provide it a administrative account that has the rights to create new computer objects and join devices to my domain. And it has to be in a UPN format. So it's not, domain/username, it's user@domain.com. And I think I remember the password. Oops. That might be wrong, but I'm not too worried. Just trying to get through this. And then we'll review and create. This will create the network. It's going to run some checks. This could take a little while, so I'm not going to wait for this. But what this is doing is it's checking things using the Network Watcher service to make sure that this connection can talk to the domain controllers. It can authenticate to the domain. It has rights to create computer objects. It has the ability to resolve the domain name, things like that. You can see here the testing one I set up before has completed. One thing I will point out is this always pops up as a warning. This can be ignored because what it does is it creates a temporary computer object in that OU we specified to make sure it can create computer objects. Well, it wants to check to make sure it successfully created that computer object. So it's looking at Azure AD, and it doesn't see that computer object because it hasn't synchronized. So this is always going to fail or have a warning, but you can ignore that. We can explain why we get it. So while that connection is being created, that's just a connection. It's not actually telling us how we're going to provision out Windows 365 desktops. That's where we need to go to the provision and policies. And I have one set up here. I'll walk through the creation real quick. But this is how we are telling Windows 365 how we want PCs to be deployed. So I'm going to give the policy a name, and then I can select which network. Now the network I just set up is still being created. It hasn't validated yet, so it doesn't show up here. So I'm just going to select my testing one that I did before, just so we can move on here. But remember, the connection is where we define the target OU for the new computer objects. Let's say you wanted to have separate OUs for the finance department and the HR department. In that case, you could create multiple connection objects that specify each OU, because maybe you have group policy that applies differently based on whether you're in HR or you're in sales and marketing or finance. So you can create multiple connection objects in Windows 365, and then you can create multiple provision policies that target those connections in Windows 365. In here, we can select what image we want. We can do a gallery image, which pulls, hit select, which will pull all of the base images from Office 365 or from Microsoft. So we have the Windows 11 Enterprise plus Microsoft apps. We can do Windows 10 if we still wanted to. But note that this has the Microsoft 365 apps baked in. So this is going to come preloaded with Outlook, Word, Excel, PowerPoint. That's all going to be baked into the image itself. Now, we're not selecting what size here. We're just telling it what image to use for Windows. We could also use a custom image. If we've uploaded an image of our own, we could select that as well. I'm just going to select Windows 11 Enterprise. And then we get to assignments. Now, this is very important. Remember, we can create multiple connections and multiple provisioning policies, but if a user is part of multiple provisioning policies, we could run into problems. And part of that is Windows 365 will use the first provisioning policy that was created that scopes a user as the authoritative provisioning policy. So you can't have multiple provisioning policies given different experiences. So if I created two provisioning policies, one contains Windows 10, one contains Windows 11, if I configured my Windows 10 provisioning policy first, a user will always get Windows 10. It will never get Windows 11. The caveat to that is after the PC is provisioned and I make a tweak to my Windows 11 provisioning policy, and that user goes to re-provision that PC, or I administratively re-provision that cloud PC for that user, it will then pull the most recently updated provisioning policy. So it can be confusing. Best practice, make sure your users are only assigned to one provisioning policy. I'm going to go ahead and just X out of this versus create one because I do have this one that is working. So there's not a whole lot of config that goes into these provisioning policies. But now that we've got that policy, how do we provision out the desktop? It's exactly the same as for business. We go to the user object in Microsoft Admin Center, go to licenses, and simply check the box. Now, once we check that box, that triggers the provisioning policy in Windows 365, and will automatically provision out that PC. Now, in my test, it took about 30 minutes for the enterprise cloud PC to be provisioned. So I'm definitely not going to sit here and wait for that. Luckily, I already have them provisioned, so I can kind of show you what those look like already. So let me jump over to the end user experience. All right, so this is my enterprise user, and you can see here it's my Joe Somebody account that is at my improvencsp.com tenant. And once the PC is provisioned, they'll be able to log into windows365.microsoft.com, and they'll see all the PCs that they have available to them. Now remember, you can only be a member of one provisioning policy, but that doesn't mean you can only have one PC. I could assign multiple licenses to this user. So if I had a Windows Enterprise 2 vCPU, 4 gig, 64 gig storage as one license, and I bought another one at a 4 CPU, 8 gig and 128 gig storage, I could assign both of those because there'll be different checkboxes as available licenses for that user. And in that case, that user will get 2 cloud PCs, one of each size. You cannot assign more than one of the same size. So this user has a 2 vCPU, 4 gig RAM, 64 gig storage Windows 11. I can't give him a second 2 vCPU, 4 gig, 64 gig storage cloud PC. You can only have one. But in here, one of the main things that I wanted to call out that's different from business, remember there was the restart, the rename, and a reset. Business will have a reset option here. That is a factory reset of that image. So the users could factory reset their own cloud PC. Probably don't want to do that. So that's user communication and training that you have to give any business users, because they could wipe out all their apps, they could wipe out all their data, especially if they're not storing everything in OneDrive. I know I'm about 5 minutes over already. Are there any questions? Otherwise, I'm just going to continue on, and soon people will be able to watch the recording. All right. So anyways, in Enterprise, that feature is not available. That's because this is administratively controlled by the IT admins. A user cannot come in here and reset their own PC. Now, I can rename it, and I've done that. I've renamed my PC CPC-Joe-Win11. The funny thing in here is that is not renaming the PC itself. That's just renaming the user's display name of that PC. So when I log into this cloud PC, it's going to show the original object name that was created automatically by Windows 365. In Active Directory, the object will be the original. And I'll actually pull that up here real quick. If I look here into this test-to-know-you, this is that cloud PC, CPC-Joe-24HE-D2. That was the automated name that Windows 365 gave this object. I've renamed it from the user interface, doesn't rename it in Active Directory, doesn't rename it in Azure AD, won't rename it in Intune. So from the administrative side, just be aware that you can't rename the users can't rename the PC. You can't, if a user says, hey, I'm at CPC-Joe.Win11, that's not their PC. That may not be their PC name. On the Windows 365 user portal, there's also this option for download remote desktop. There's also this button right here. I'm going to go ahead and click on that to show you what's available. This is the remote desktop client that will support Windows 11 and virtual PCs or cloud PC instances. You can see here that's available for Windows, it's available for Mac, iOS, and Android. It is not available for Linux or Chromebook. Those two don't have supported, at least that I'm aware of, remote desktop clients that you can use to access the cloud PC. Doesn't mean you can't access a cloud PC from a Linux box. You just have to use a HTML5 compatible browser. So let me go back here. I'm going to go ahead and launch this so you see what it looks like. So if the user comes into the web browser here, they see open in browser, click on that, it's going to open up their PC, it's going to ask them to log in. Now we can select what we want to kind of share across this session, just like remote desktop. We want to share the printer, the clipboard, the microphone. I'm just going to hit connect, and it should prompt me for my password. Awesome. Here we go. If I can remember this password correctly. Here we go. So now I'm logging in through the browser to my cloud PC. So this view will be just like a regular cloud PC. I could maximize my window by hitting this expand button up here, in which would make it full screen. If you have multiple displays, this will support multiple displays as well. So you could access your cloud PC from a web browser and go across screens. This is my Windows 11 image. You can see I already have all the Word and all Office 365 apps pre-installed, but I also have Chrome. And that's because I created an Intune app policy to push Chrome out to my desktops. So I can manage this PC via Intune and push out applications, manage them, manage updates. All that configuration can be in, according to Microsoft, is recommended to be via Intune. Trying to think what else I wanted to cover on the enterprise instance here. That's pretty much, it's a Windows 11 desktop. You're not going to see a huge difference from what we just saw on the Windows 11 demo itself. But this is how you can access it from a browser. We can also access it from, great, my PC. Well, my PC was asleep, and now I just closed it. You'll notice here I have to enter a password in to unencrypt this. That's because this has a virtual TPM, because Windows 11 will not install if your device does not have a TPM. So I have a virtual TPM in this virtual machine, which allowed me to install Windows 11 from an ISO, because again, I'm running on a processor that's not fully supported. So on the desktop, we can install the remote desktop client. And that, again, that's available for Mac OS, that's available on Windows. There's even a mobile client for iOS and Android. So if you're using an iPad, you could get to your cloud PC from an iPad. So let me log in as my enterprise user here. All right. So I've already installed the app, but I haven't configured it. And that's what this app is right here. When you first launch this app, it's not going to know all your cloud PCs. You have to connect to a subscription. There's two options. One is subscribe with this button or subscribe with a URL. Subscribing with the blue button here where it just says subscribe is going to launch the Windows. It's going to pull your logged in account if you are using single sign-on. Doesn't mean you couldn't use a separate account, but this is going to authenticate and try to connect to all of your cloud PCs based on your account. Now, let's say you're given a URL or you're given a tenant or a PC in a different tenant. So in my case, I have a Windows Business PC under my Leonard user. Let me find my browser for that. I'm not signed in as, whoops, that's wrong browser, sorry guys. Is this that's the wrong browser. Oh well. I'll just do it this way. I could pull when you look at the download remote desktop, there's this get subscription URL link. If I click on that, this is a pretty generic link. It's not anything unique to my tenant, but you could copy that link, and then on the remote desktop app itself on your desktop, you could paste that link in. So I'm going to go ahead and add another subscription. I'm not going to subscribe with the URL. I'll subscribe using my account for Leonard. And now that should pull in my Windows 365 business PC. So I could connect to both of those from this desktop. Go ahead and clicking on one of those. I'll go to my enterprise first. And this is going to launch pretty much a regular standard remote desktop. Actually, that will fail because that's using Windows Hello, and I don't have that fully set up. So I'm going to log in as my user. I can remember my password. And now it's going to look just like regular remote desktop. All right, so I can get to my cloud PC and do whatever I want. On my web browser, I had this. You can see here I've been disconnected because it's a single session with Windows 365 cloud PCs. You can't have multiple sessions to a cloud PC. So let me go back to, where is it? Here we go. To my Windows desktop here, and I'm also going to connect to my business PC. Now remember when I provisioned my business cloud PC, I didn't get an option of what image I wanted to select. I just simply assigned the license, and that was it. That's because Microsoft is managing those images. So when I log into my business PC by default, I am going to get Windows 10. Now that doesn't mean Windows 11 isn't coming to Windows 365 for business. It's just not there yet. So to my knowledge, you can't force the upgrade yet in Windows 365 for business. You might be able to, I just haven't fully tested it, but from what I've heard, you can't. So if you get a Windows 10 image, you're kind of stuck with it until Microsoft makes the Windows 11 images available for business. But again, you can interact with this desktop just as if it were any other desktop through remote desktop or the remote desktop client. So I've gone through the demos there. I know I'm way over time, but for the recording purposes, I'm going to touch upon Azure Virtual Desktop real quick. So Azure Virtual Desktop is the full VDI platform for Microsoft. These are pools of desktops. So these are going to support things that Windows 365 just doesn't support. You know, things like multi-session, you know, having a single desktop that can support multiple users, right? With Windows 365, a single desktop goes to a single user. Remote app. So maybe you don't want to present the entire desktop to a user, but you want to present a line of business application only. You can do that with Azure Virtual Desktop. So instead of launching a full remote desktop session, I click on the app instead, and it just launches a window that looks just like the app that's running on a virtual PC somewhere else. The main thing here is that it scales automatically and supports multi-session desktops. So what that really means is if you're using, let's say you have 15 employees that work in a certain department, but you have 3 shifts, a morning, afternoon, and overnight shift, morning, evening, and night shift. So out of those 15 employees, you may at any time only have, on average, 10 employees working at once. So there's no need to spend for 15 Azure Virtual Desktops, you spend for 10. You have 10 in a pool, and then when users log in, they get associated to one of those PCs in that pool. And because it supports multi-session, their user profile follows them using the user profile disk. That way they get all their same settings, their same data, customizations, all that kind of follows them over, even though it's maybe a different virtual PC that they're logging into. But let's say that you have an instance where all 15 employees have to come in one day at the same time. Well, Azure Virtual Desktop can automatically scale and provision out additional PCs. So now it has 15 hosts in the pool instead of only 10. And then it can deprovision those when that demand is no longer there. So it gives you this automated scaling. Another feature for Azure Virtual Desktop is it has GPU-enabled machines. So if you're doing anything that is high graphic demands, video editing or publishing, you can do that in Azure Virtual Desktop. And right now, this is unique to Azure Virtual Desktop, but it is in the pipeline. There's no, to my knowledge, no established date for this for Windows 365, but it's been stated that it will come as an available SKU for Windows 365. And then if you have other VDI platforms like Citrix or VMware in place, you can extend those by leveraging Azure Virtual Desktop as the quote-unquote physical hardware behind the scenes. and using Citrix and VMware as the presentation layer to those desktops. But you can take advantage of then the auto scaling and everything that Azure provides. So when is it right to use Windows 365 and when is it right to use Azure Virtual Desktop? So Windows 365, remember from the very beginning, is designed for simplicity. You don't have to have dedicated experience in managing a VDI solution. It's very simple, other than for enterprise, we set up a little bit on the AD side, the virtual networking side, but you saw that I could do that in a matter of minutes, given that it took a little while for some of those connections to establish. But it doesn't take a whole lot of time to establish the prerequisites on the Azure side for Windows 365 Enterprise. And that's mostly a one and done kind of configuration. You may have to tweak those over time, but for the most part, once you get it up and running, it's there and you can use it. So on the Windows 365 side, it's very simple. It's also predictable user pricing because it's a per user cost per month that's not based on consumption. The one little asterisk there is that there could be some Azure Virtual Network costs for enterprise. Now, the virtual networking costs are often very low, so you're probably not going to see a huge spike in that, but there could be some additional costs based on network traffic for the VNet side on enterprise only. On the virtual desktop, Azure Virtual Desktop side, this is where you need to have much more granular control because Windows 365 does limit what you can do from an administration standpoint, especially on the business side. But if you wanted full control over those desktops and their configurations and their settings, the virtual hardware configurations, you have that within Azure Virtual Desktop. You also have those abilities that I mentioned before, like multi-session and app streaming, but also data residency is a big one. If you have users that operate out of the EU and their data has to stay in the EU, you could have Azure Virtual Desktop pools that live in EU regions, so the data never leaves the EU. So if you need that scalability, if you need that ability to be very customized or address very specific workloads, Azure Virtual Desktop may be the right choice. But the hope is that Windows 365 becomes more of that go-to option because of its simplicity and its ease of consumption. So I rambled on a lot. Real quick before we wrap up, just quick check on where we are in our webinar series. We have all of our previous sessions recorded at the URL on this slide here. We are currently in our Intro to Windows 11 and Windows 365 today, and we will be wrapping up our series in December with a session called Looking Back, and we're just going to kind of recap. It's in a roundtable discussion, recap what we've seen trend-wise over 2021 as far as security and endpoints. So I do appreciate everyone joining in to this session, bearing with me as I've run about 20 minutes over. But I do appreciate everyone's attendance and hope to see you next time. I will stick on here. I'll stop the recording, but I will stick on for a little bit if there are any questions. So thanks again.
Great job, Chris.